Hello, my friends, and welcome to another episode of Unlimited. Today, we are talking about reclaiming humanity through grief. This was not the topic that I had planned to do for this one, and actually I'm doing it extremely last minute, but I have been sitting and processing and listening, and it feels needed. I'm also not an expert on grief, and perhaps I will have someone come on at some point. I did do an episode in the pandemic with my friend Lisa Zaratny on grief, and it was more of an individual focus of processing grief, and I felt like we needed to talk about a broader scope of grief and processing grief, because I'm feeling it. On so many levels, so many layers of grief. I'm seeing it. I'm seeing it being processed in ways that are extremely unhelpful. I'm seeing it processed in ways that are healing. And I wanted to name it because I think I've been struggling and confused and uncertain how to show up. And in processing and learning and researching for this episode, I found a lot of support in just the understanding and space for this really important aspect of us as humans. I'm engaging types of grief, including traumatic grief, communal grief, and historical grief, understanding anger and processing grief, algorithms and community, discernment in media, and reclaiming humanity. I have not given myself a lot of space for editing this episode, so I hope that you will bear with me on that side of things and that this is supportive for you. As always, if you would like to speak with me, if you have thoughts, if you would like some support, I'm here for you. Please don't hesitate to reach out, and without further ado, let's get started. Hey there, I'm Valerie Friedlander, Certified Life Business Alignment Coach, and this is Unlimited. This podcast bridges the individual and the societal, scientific and spiritual, positive and negative, nerdy and no, there's just a lot of nerdy. Come on board and let's unlock a life that's as badass as you are. Let's start with understanding these different types of grief that are impacting us all right now. And also note that there are a lot of links in the show notes. If you want to dig further in, you will see that I've pulled a lot from these articles, mostly from Psychology Today. I stayed focused on that as a source of information. I did think it was interesting that there was very little that was talking about the present moment. Most of what I pulled from were speaking to the dynamics from the pandemic, from historical research and racialized trauma, as well as just general grief processing and the dynamics of the media, especially social media. So starting with grief. Grief is the natural response to losing something or someone who we formed feelings for. As humans, we are wired to form attachments. That is something we'll be talking a little bit more about in the next episode that I have about belonging. And grief can look like attachments that we've lost to people, to things, to ideas, to concepts, and even to certain aspects of our own identity. The fear of pain and the grief that is related to that can also create that idea of losing face. It's our social identity. And so when our social identity shifts, there can be aspects of grief involved. And it's one of the pieces that we have a lot of resistance to, is that fear of the grief, fear of the pain of loss of a certain social identity. And that can also come into play in terms of the dynamics of how we relate to social media and those aspects, which I'm going to bring up later. Traumatic grief is when there is sudden loss or violent loss. And I'm going to dig a little bit more into the processing of and the differentiation between traumatic and non-traumatic grief. The other form of grief I want to look at is collective grief, which occurs when a community, society, town, city, nation, or the whole world collectively experiences extreme change or loss. And then there's historical trauma, which is an event or set of events that happens to a group of people who share a specific identity, and that results in the significant disruption of traditional ways of life, culture, and identity. Research exploring historical trauma examines how the felt trauma of these events is held internally and passed down to future generations, such that family members who have not directly experienced the trauma are impacted by its effects generations later. Studies conducted with the children of Holocaust survivors have led to scientific evidence connecting historical trauma to a change in the human body at the cellular level. This research has suggested that stressful environmental conditions may leave an imprint on the epigenome that is passed down to future generations. That description was pulled from the Psychology Today article, Why Historical Trauma is Critical Understanding Black Mental Health. Some other resources related to that are from people like Resmaa Menakem and Gabor Mate, who both speak to the body's relationship to trauma and historical trauma, generational trauma, and the dynamics of trauma. I'm seeing all of these aspects of trauma and grief and traumatic grief and collective grief showing up in the ways that we are interacting with each other and with ourselves and with social media in particular. As someone with an online business, it's very difficult to navigate social media. It's not my favorite place to be anyway. I think there can be a lot of value there, but I'm also very cognizant of the dynamics in that space, as well as mainstream media. But I'm more of a consumer of that than I am a participant in that. So there's dynamics at play within all of these. So hopefully this will kind of help connect some of them a bit. In the article, The Lived Experience of Traumatic Grief, How Our Grief Differs When We Lose a Loved One from Violence, Patricia Harney talks about the 5 stages of grief that came from the 1969 book On Death and Dying by psychiatrist Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. Those stages are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. A lot of people think that that happens in order and that all of those happen. What we've learned since that book came out through studies is that this is not a really great example of what happens in grief because it looks more like different, like there's cognitive aspects and emotional aspects and behaviors all listed in those stages of grief. Whereas the experience is much more like a series of emotional states, not stages. And these states fluctuate and overlap. So to kind of separate out the emotional processing from the behaviors and actions, because those aren't always present. So we're going to talk a little bit about behaviors and actions as well, but holding space for those emotional states is really key. Non-traumatic grief differentiates from traumatic grief in that non-traumatic grief involves sadness. It involves disbelief, which is like it's hard to comprehend the loss, but that's not the same as denial and non-reality. There can be guilt and regret around missed opportunities, rumination and cloudy thoughts as we process, and loss of appetite, tightness in our chest, lethargy. There's no timeline on this kind of grief, but research has found that the intensity of the sadness, guilt, regret, and anger diminish for the most part after about 1.5 years. And so though we might miss the person we've lost the rest of our lives, usually we are able to attend to the present more fully somewhere around 6 to 18 months. Now, traumatic grief related to sudden loss or violent loss activates our stress response, the fight, flight, freeze. Grief from traumatic loss can feel like you're living in a different plane of existence. Your body is too small to hold all the feelings. The freeze response can kick in, which leaves us mentally blank, not just foggy, but just like almost numb and shut down. Thoughts and feelings are just shut down. We may shift between a frozen state and a startled state, from feeling overwhelmed to feeling numb. Things like sounds can seem very muted or overly harsh. So it's this kind of back and forth of extremes, from freeze and shut down to hypervigilance, hyperarousal. There can be intrusive mental images that occur, preoccupation with perpetrators or the event. Known or imagined details of what happened can evoke actual physical sensations. And the feelings of despair, anguish, and terror are often present in this space as well. In the article, Anyone Else Angry? The Link Between Trauma and Anger, Understanding Anger in the Aftermath of Traumatic Events Can Enhance Recovery, Susan B. Phillips talks about anger and the aspect of anger, which is kind of, we talk about the freeze and flight response, and then there's the fight response, which is where anger comes in. Anger is self-protective. Anger is a way of trying to regain control when we feel out of control. And with traumatic events, that anger can color everything else. It can be experienced as a physiological state, an emotion, a way of thinking, a way of behaving, or a combination of these things. One of the impacts of trauma is an assault on our sense of control. So like I said, that sense of ability to be in charge of our lives, to protect ourselves, to protect the people we care about, to protect our home and our life. So often the anger or rage that we feel in this experience can take the form of self-blame, like if only I, why didn't I should have. This can be pushed away. The pain of those thoughts is pushed away through anger at others that can come out directed outside of oneself. It also creates more loneliness and isolation because the shame can block us from feeling a connection or feel like we're being outside of others, outside of community. And sometimes that pain is so well masked by anger that you might be unaware of how much you're suffering internally and that internal experience that's happening. So finding a safe space to connect with others and engage that pain is crucial. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this later, but all trauma involves loss and a crisis of self that can leave us trying to hold on any way we can. And so anger is one of those things that we use to shield ourselves. It's self-protective. It's the fight response to shield us from the pain, to lessen terror, to reduce a sense of helplessness. So when we can find a space to connect with others where we can put that down and feel held is really important to being able to move through the anger and through the pain into a way of showing up that aligns with who we really want to be. Attempts to suppress or deny grief are just as likely to prolong the process and then also demand additional emotional effort. So what happens is that while it may give us some relief in the moment, long term, it is detrimental. Now, I do want to say here that sometimes anger is what helps move us into action. But when we're experiencing traumatic grief, especially on a collective, even global scale, especially when we don't have direct impact on it, the anger can move us into action in a way that is misaligned. So I want to make sure that I'm clear. I'm not saying any of this. We're not talking about this to minimize anything that's happening out in the world, but to help you be mindful of what's happening inside you and inside people that you care about. Part of the reason I want to talk about this is because I'm seeing so many rifts between people who care about each other, who know each other. And some of this is to be able to process that, to be able to care for ourselves and care for others in a way that then allows us to show up as human beings in our full humanity. I wrote recently in a social media post about emotional processing. And one thing I see is that people will say they don't know how to feel about a situation. And that can point to that numbness, that overwhelm. Even whatever your relationship is, direct or indirect, to the dynamics that are happening in the world, we are all feeling it. Like trees talk to each other, our energies talk to each other. And so we need to hold space for this processing because it does impact all of us and our shared humanity. So if you are disconnected from the feelings of it in some way, make sure that you are checking in, because not knowing what to think about something or to do about something is not the same as not knowing how you feel. So if you truly don't know how you feel, stop and take some intentional space to reconnect to your emotional self in a safe space, in a connected space. You don't have to understand whatever is going on to have feelings about what's happening. And we don't usually at first. That's part of the reason why I'm doing this episode, is because you may be feeling things in your body. You may be aware of what your emotional state is, but you may not know what to do with it or be able to understand it. And sometimes having understanding can help us center and care for what needs care to be able to then show up and act in a way that supports what we want to create in the world versus acting out of the trauma, acting out of the anger, acting out of the sorrow, removing ourselves from anything related, which is also removing ourselves from being connected and in this shared human experience. So you also don't have to be right to feel. Feelings aren't right or wrong. Grief isn't right or wrong. Grief is a feeling, and it's not about what's happening external to you. It is about what's happening internal to you. Not to say that, again, what's happening external isn't a thing. It's just important to recognize what's happening internally first. So you don't need to justify having feelings before allowing yourself to be aware of them. Facts are not required for feelings, and that need can block you from awareness of facts and point you in directions that are not actually supportive for the way you want to show up in the world. So again, also don't turn your feelings into facts, which is what can happen also when we don't feel supported, when we don't feel our grief is validated. We can look for validation in spaces that aren't actually supportive. We end up looking for validation for ourselves and our identity versus for our grief and our emotions, which are related but not the same. And so it blocks our ability to receive information. We kind of shut down because, again, that self-preservation kicks in. So it's important to process the feelings first so that you have space for processing facts, especially because we're surrounded by misinformation and the algorithms, again, that I'm going to get to in a minute. But only once we do that can we take informed, intentional action. Action from trauma, from traumatic grief, can perpetuate trauma. Your emotional self and having connection to that and being aware of that and supporting that is integral to showing up from a place of humanity. Avoiding grief is something that I see a lot of. And in doing that, in avoiding grief, it denies that human part of yourself. And it's not always intentional. So what this is an invitation to take a look at it, to see where you are with it. It can look like an inability to acknowledge and allow space for grief in yourself or in others, denying others' right to grieve and like creating grief hierarchies, who has the right to grieve, who doesn't. Weaponizing grief against others, that's where anger can come in, and if anger is motivating behavior. Seeking online validation for your grief, regardless of the sources, again, looking for that validation from places that aren't actually healthy for validation to come from when it comes to your emotional state. And then, of course, the escapism, unhealthy coping mechanisms, ways of masking pain. So eating, drinking, shopping, isolating yourself, those sorts of things. It is unhelpful, as I just mentioned, to compare levels of grief, to minimize grief, or as sometimes comes up, that encouraging closure, to find closure on your grief. That's not helpful. So if you are supporting somebody grieving, or if you're showing up with someone grieving, that can actually look like a way, especially when we're dealing with communal grief, of avoiding grief, right? That's that not allowing space for the grief to be what it is. It is helpful to offer practical assistance if you're in a space to be able to do so, to listen, to acknowledge what someone's experiencing, and validate emotions. Validating emotions, again, is not the same thing as saying this is true or based in fact or anything like that. It's acknowledging someone's experience. The other thing I want to throw in here is also not to judge someone's body language, especially when we're talking about trauma. Sometimes you might see somebody talking about something that they've experienced as traumatic, and they might be smiling. And then you're like, oh, is that true? And this has happened with even as minimal as like my kid being upset or having something happen, and you're like, oh, are you telling the truth because you're smiling? Smiling, it can be a way of minimizing traumatic experience, defense to protect against feeling the depth of the actual pain, an indicator of embarrassment or shame. So just notice that, and if you have any judgments around it, a lot of times people don't even realize that's what they're doing. There's an article that talks about this, Why Clients Smile When Talking About Trauma, by Lisa Ferencz. Some suggestions when it comes to supporting yourself and allowing space for healing and clarity in how you show up would be to start with knowing that it is okay to not be okay. It is okay to be in grief, and to find spaces that can hold you as you process that grief. Spaces with trusted others to engage the pain that you're experiencing, acknowledging that you're experiencing traumatic grief and connecting with others, and real connection. So one of the things I've talked about is I see people engaging and looking for connection on social media. Take a break from social media, not engage at all. We're not talking about disappear and shut down and not engage. But take a break from it, because one of the things to be aware of with social media is that the algorithms tracking you are often triggered by your negative emotions, typically impulsivity or anger. In the article, The Many Faces, Anxiety and Trauma, Social Media, the Matrix, and Digital Tribalism by Arash Javanbakat, he talks about how these algorithms amplify the negative and then spread it by sharing it among groups. Also acknowledging that we're inherently tribal creatures, particularly when we're scared. So we can regress further into tribalism and tend to trust the information relayed to us by our tribe and not by others. This has evolutionary advantage. Trust leads to group cohesion. It can help us survive. But the scrolling and swiping culture has reduced our attention span, and it limits what we see. We spend 1.7 to 2.5 seconds on a Facebook newsfeed item. And this has also deactivated our critical thinking skills. So The matrix does the thinking, we consume the ideology, and we're bolstered by the likes from our tribe mates. So this creates what I was talking about before, that idea of face, that social face. It's not the same thing as performativeness, but it is what influences how we show up and who we connect to, is that idea, that social face, who we believe we are, and thus who we are connecting to. One of the things that I'm seeing here is that there are a lot of people who feel unseen by the tribe that they have had cultivated in social media. So the grief that they're experiencing, the feelings that are coming up for them, did not feel acknowledged. And then so it has amplified the grief in a sense of loss of community. And then, of course, activated this need to self-protect, going back to that anger response, and then seeking safety and validation, regardless of truth, from other sources, as well as what I often refer to as screaming into the void, which is what it will feel like to me when I'm just talking and I don't have any response. It can feel like just yelling into this void and this sense of helplessness. And so this disconnect has magnified the grief, activated the anger. And so getting off of social media and connecting with people in real life, maybe not even necessarily in person, but actually talking to real human beings, the ones who you understand cared about you, reaching out to them, bridging across the fear. And at this point, it's hard because of the time that's passed, but bridging across that and reaching out and connecting in shared humanity. Again, reconnecting to our humanity. It can feel very isolating online. It has, even in times where we aren't experiencing collective traumatic grief, and more so in these spaces. So additional to that, if you're noticing that happening for you, also being mindful of your sources of information. The article Misinformation and Trauma, How to Watch a War Online by Joe Pierre talks about confirmation bias and motivated reasoning. So we're very good at disbelieving what we don't want to believe. And so there are 3 things we need to help us process information. And I would add the 4th and first being that processing our own emotional space and allowing ourselves safe space for grief, again, which is not related to truth. It is a feeling that we have internally. And then activating what he describes as intellectual humility, which is about acknowledging that we can always be wrong and that all of our beliefs should be thought of as probability judgments, not absolutes. Cognitive flexibility, which means being able to take on other points of view, and if not necessarily believing different perspectives, then at least being able to understand where they're coming from. And analytical thinking is the most relevant to the detection of misinformation. It's mostly about slowing down and thinking skeptically before accepting at face value information that represents what we want to believe. Consuming and sharing misinformation can take away from real issues and real things that need our engagement. So being able to check in on the information we're consuming and the way that we're showing up to that information. The other aspect of this can be avoiding any social media. And so I want to recognize, as he does, not exposing ourselves to horrors may seem self-protective, but it can also amount to a kind of denial or avoidance that can increase anxiety in the long run while doing nothing to help the victims of violence. So giving yourself that space to be able to check in on your emotions, have a safe space for processing your feelings, being able to use those discernments of information that you're consuming, and then showing up with intention. So that next piece would be taking action. Use your skills, experience, expertise, unique perspectives to do something to help your fellow human beings, to create the world, to feed into the world that you want to live in, rather than being reactive to the world that's happening. Valerie Kaur, civil rights leader, has a post where she listed several things, and I really appreciate it. So I'm going to share it here. Some of the things that she suggests are donate to aid, go to a vigil, organize a vigil, make art, make music, go to a teach-in, host a teach-in, post, don't post, meditate, march, make a container for grief, another for rage, talk to children, tell stories of peace builders, study liberation, pray, kiss the earth, look at the stars, call the ancestors, learn the names of the dead children, make an altar for them, bring people together, feed them, light candles, sing songs, give freely, start an authentic exchange with someone who is already doing the same. Be silent, speak, then be silent again. Rest. We live into what we imagine. Imagine the world as it could be. Paint that world, sing that world, invite it into your dreams. Practice that world in the space available to you. Practice the world as it could be. Step away to breathe. Return to push. Remember that we may not live to see the world we labor for, and that's okay. When we labor with love, we glimpse the world as it could be. And it is beautiful. Trust your part in the labor. Which is yours? I encourage you. Dare to feel. Dare to connect. Dare to lose face. Dare to be human. Dare to see others' humanity. Dare to care about their life. Remember, they are we. And I'll end with another quote by Valerie, because, Valerie. She said, "Opening our hearts to grief, others, and our own is how we hold our humanity in a world that would destroy it. It's how we will begin to survive this." Thank you for being here. As always, I appreciate you. If you want someone to hear you, someone to listen, if you have things you'd like to share or just to sit and be, please reach out. I'm here for you. We need to connect to each other. So connect to other people. Check out the resources I have in the show notes. And stay tuned for my next episode where I am talking to Amina Chaudhry about belonging. And I'll talk to you then. Thanks for listening. I so appreciate you being here. If you got something out of today's episode, please share it. Leave me a review, take a screenshot, and post it on social with a shout out to me. Send it to a friend or, all of the above. Want to hang out more? Join me on Instagram. Or better yet, get on my mailing list to make sure you don't miss out on anything. And remember, your possibilities are as unlimited as you are. Allow yourself to shine, my friend. The world needs your light. See you next time.